Good morning, everybody. Hope you all are doing well today. Just want to make a quick reminder to make sure that you're doing your discussion board. Also, remember that next week is going to be your reflection paper number 2. So, as I've mentioned before, if you have any questions, please let me know. Some of y'all have emailed me about that, and I've really greatly appreciated that opportunity to be able to help out where I can. However, like I said, just make sure that you're kind of staying on the ball with that. And in addition to that, start considering what you might want to do with regards to your final paper, considering that spring break is coming around the corner after this upcoming week. So just make sure we're on the same track, on the same page. Think about a theory that you would really like to explore when it comes to persuasion. I covered over a lot of them this past Wednesday or Thursday, I can't remember. So make sure you're covering over those. Those will be very helpful. If you need any additional description help with that, please let me know, and we'll get on that. But it will also help you with your third reflection paper as we get along to it. So today, I do want to mention a little bit about this idea of social proofs. And this is something that we mentioned at the beginning of this week of shifting a little bit from the cognitive side, your intrapersonal communication side, to the interpersonal, your one-on-one communication. Or in this case, it can be a group as well. So we're focusing kind of both in this case in terms of not only the interpersonal, but group as well. And with social proof, a lot of the things do have a bit of a mix with liking in the chapter of Cialdini. So they mentioned both social proof and liking within 2 separate chapters, but they're pretty close in terms of some of the things that we have when it comes to the social aspect of not only being liked, but kind of doing a monkey see, monkey do. I mean, we've probably heard that maxim before. And the focus of it is, why do we do these things in terms of we go back to the old maxim of, if your friends jump off a bridge, would you? And I know that's old and kind of outdated, but it is still kind of an important consideration of, what does it mean to follow those when you're unsure of something? So, could just be curious, because again, we do like to be liked by, and it doesn't have to be with everybody, but it is with people we want to feel closest to. So that can be a group mentality. The other thing you can think about to start off with is, I see this a lot when it comes to people that are walking down the street, because I walk around campus a lot. And one of the things I usually notice is when I'm walking and I notice that there are a couple people looking in a certain direction very intently, it is my tendency to look at the same thing that they're looking at. Regardless of what it is, you can look at this from the solar eclipse perspective, which I hope that nobody looked directly at. But I guess, you never can tell in some cases. But it's an interesting social experiment to do, is have, a group of people stare at nothing and just look at a certain direction and see how people that are passing by react. Do they look in that certain direction? And that is the power of that social proof of group communication, non-verbally, of course. But it is important when we consider these things, because we are often persuaded by groups and social norms. And there's a couple of things I want to talk about when it comes to saving face, pluralistic ignorance, similarity, the Werther effect, and what's called the People's Temple. So these are 5 areas within Cialdini that I thought were really interesting, and I really wanted to share some of these with you and think about this as we go along. Now, saving face is a colloquialism that we've probably all heard of at one point or another, especially if you're about to do something that you don't want to do. So, you go to a dinner party, you go to a reunion, you go to your significant other's event, within work or something, and you really don't want to go. But what do? You save face. You almost kind of project a different emotion than you're feeling just so that the other person looks good or you look good or someone's looking good. And I've often said that this is a perceptive thing when it comes to things like Facebook, for instance, that, we have been kind of indoctrinated to say to ourselves, you need to act a certain way on Facebook because, again, the employers might be looking. And so we can curb a lot of our opinions and beliefs, as well as values, attitudes, so forth, just because we would sit here and say, I want to save face on Facebook. In this case, and it's almost like it's our own personal PR. I probably have mentioned that one time or another, but we want to keep that reputation and we want to defend it when challenged. One thing that Cialdini talks about, and I still haven't gotten to this theory yet, and I feel like I should have gotten to it a long time ago because they keep referencing the book When Prophecy Fails by Leon Festinger, where he looked at a cult and how this aspect of the cults work. Even when they fail, we would go searching. I'm not saying we, as I've been in one or led one, but what I am trying to say is when a group of people are bound in an uncertainty, one of the things we do is try to find more like-minded people to support us. And some of these can be, obviously very negative things. The world of anonymity for online users can be kind of a dangerous place, especially, if you're in certain groups that would be intended to harm people. Those like-minded attitudes can be very positive, but they can also be very negative. So that's one thing. But for instance, I've never lived in Pennsylvania, but I've always identified as a Penguins fan, a Pittsburgh Penguins fan in hockey, and it was difficult for me before the Carolina Hurricanes came into town because that was the only hockey team. Well, that was a hockey team that I really enjoyed, but with Carolina not being around, I didn't have a home team, so naturally I just picked a team to support. Now, granted, I've had a lot of success recently in this case, but I also married my wife who's from Buffalo, and there's a lot of dissonance when it comes to some of their sports teams. Either being a Bills or a Sabres fan. Now, I like the Sabres, but I try to adopt. I never really had an NFL team, so I kind of drifted towards the Bills, and my brother-in-laws would sit there and say, you better know what you're getting into when you're picking this team, because there's a lot of dissonance that comes with it. And this whole ideology of like-mindedness, even when things go wrong, when we're at the most uncertain, we try to hang on to some of those social connections. And the interesting thing about it, especially in sports communication, and this can actually be a very positive thing, is when teams are bad, that camaraderie that you have with a group of people to kind of maintain that consonance is a major deal. And it's a very strong thing to say, we're saving face even though we know things are bad. We know things that aren't going well, but yet we keep true to the people closest around us and what we like. So, and it's hard to revert back on that belief. So we rely on people who think like us. So it's kind of, this whole lecture today is going to be a little bit heavy in terms of some of the topics that come up, because again, social influence is difficult. A couple of things that Cialdini mentions are almost like a lemming effect, where we see somebody basically jump off a cliff, we do the exact same thing, and some of this deals with what's called pluralistic ignorance. And we may have heard of the colloquialism of the blind leading the blind. And what does that mean when it comes to these social proofs here? So when uncertainty is our emotion, we have to turn to those with certainty. And that can be difficult from time to time, because sometimes we think that groups, in a sense, are most safe. And that if I'm within a collective, I don't feel as nervous as if I do with just one other person, for instance. So, that comes into play a lot, that, we do feel safe when we're in a group of people, with a group of people and so forth. But there is the interesting case, and disturbing case for that matter, of Catherine Genovese, who was murdered. And this was a particular case where she was stabbed to death over a span of like 30 some odd minutes, and nobody called the police. And this was broad daylight, people around, everybody, so many people saw it, and it's disgusting that you would sit there and say, why didn't anybody help this person? Why didn't anybody stand up and, try to intervene, or, call the cops at least? Why was this, even a situation in the first place where somebody's life was in danger with so many people around? And the thought process that went along with it is, sometimes we hear you shouldn't call the police because it's already been taken care of. And so if there's so many people, someone will probably sit there and say, well, I think that this has probably already been taken care of. Someone had to have. This is so disgusting that someone should have said something by now. And I'm just, not that person. I probably caught it way too late. And so, what happens is, unfortunately, this young lady passed away. And again, a disgusting scenario, but, sometimes we don't have safety in numbers. It's not the answer, because if we have one other person, so let's say, instead of 30, 40 people that are watching this, we've only got one person that's watching this. If it's just one other person, they know that they're the ones that are responsible for the other person's well-being, so they may intervene. And that's really interesting as well, is if you've only got a few people, they may sit here and say, I'm the only one that's seen this, so I have to act. And so that social proof in terms of group versus interpersonal can make a big difference as well, in terms of how we react in certain situations. In this case, it was a pretty extreme example. But the whole notion that it may be just one other person with you that, again, they feel personally responsible because they're the only ones that can help. So a major component that comes with this social proof. So that was two. The third one talks about what's called similarity. And in this particular case, we tend to like people who are like us. This is why we have voters that talk about the I'll have a beer with this person effect to it. When trying to vote for a president, we want people who are like us. And this is usually why, like during natural disasters, local media teams will often come in and interview people who are much like us. Jeff Foxworthy used to say they never film a doctor or a lawyer with these kind of events happen. And it's not just because of interest, it's because, again, similarity. We feel with some of these people that, we're watching in this case. And again, we see this with our leaders as well. We want to have people who are confident. We also want to have people that are likable. We've talked about ethos in the past, that it's not just this inherent credibility that comes up. There's also a likability factor that comes into play when we talk about the people that we trust the most in this case. So that's the third one. The fourth one is what's called a Werther effect. And this basically was the area of when a news story about suicide was put into major news coverage. More people engaged in the activities subsequently after this had happened. And it's kind of messed up in this case, because, you would sit there and say, maybe because we're sharing this information, we're increasing of awareness of how horrible this is, but yet this is what people end up doing just because all this coverage is on this. And granted, when I first looked at this, I might sit here and say this was kind of an outdated reference, because I think it was between the 1940s and 50s for the Werther effect in this case. But a really recent example just kind of fell into my lap, and it really kind of spoke to this Werther effect in terms of how much major news television can have an effect in this case. Now, I'm going to be careful with using the term effect, but, a correlation exists here. And the one example that I'm thinking of is what a lot of people have been posting all over social media right now is the Tide Pod Challenge. And as ridiculous as it is, and as it sounds, and as we would all say we've done a lot of dumb things as kids, but eating Tide Pods is not one of them. The interesting thing about this, though, is if you look at the correlations between when this first started happening versus the implementation of news media covering it, there were only a few cases of this actually happening when it comes to videos that were uploaded and calls to disease or poison control about this particular instance. However, it was when a lot of news media outlets started covering this is when the spike of people started doing this more. And I've got a video about this. It's a little causal, so I tend to take it with a grain of salt, but I'll share it on As You Learn. It's a real interesting video about what it is about the Tide Pod Challenge that really wasn't as big a deal until major news outlets started taking a hold of it, and then more and more people started doing it, which would agree with the Werther effect in this case. And so, again, it's a little troubling that when we have a group of people that are doing something, and kind of as a diffusion, we tend to pick up on that, and that happens a lot. I'll give you a good example for this was a theory called the diffusion of innovations. And you may have heard of this. It's a bell curve that talks about like people who are early adopters, people who are early majority, late majority, laggards, and so forth in terms of how a trend takes into play. So the one interesting one that book I have actually. I have right here, Everett Rogers. You don't need to buy this or anything, but it's a really good book. Everett Rogers, really good book to be able to read. In the first chapter, and it actually tells a really cool story about the keyboard we have. Mine is disgusting. I'm so sorry that I have to show you this. It's the QWERTY keyboard, is what they call it. So if you look at the home row right here, the QWERTY. So the QWERTY keyboard here was actually originally invented for typewriters. This is how this actually came into play here. And if you look at your keyboard while you're watching this video, one of the appeals for this was you could type typewriter up on this home row, and you wouldn't have to go in anywhere else. You could type typewriter up on this front row, and this is actually one of the big selling points for this particular type of keyboard in this case. The interesting thing was the design of it was specifically so that people would type slower. And it's so funny how some of these social proofs work, because the reason for why this keyboard is what it is right now is because when it was a typewriter, keys would start to jam together. And so when these keys started to jam together, they would have to kind of repair the keyboard. And then that would be a very difficult thing in terms of, let's say you're writing a dissertation on a typewriter. You'd have to redo the entire page if you had a typo or something. So that's pretty detrimental. However, it reverted to computers, and now that these keys don't stick together, the QWERTY keyboard here is actually an ineffective means of typing in this case. In fact, there's another one, and I'm blanking on the name of it, but there's another type of keyboard that actually breaks all the records if people are used to it, that they actually make the keyboard more friendly to typing when it comes to actually using the computer. In fact, one of the most interesting things is the middle, so your ASDF is actually mixed up a little bit because it actually favors your left hand. So people who are left-handed, it would actually work really well with a QWERTY keyboard versus people who are right-handed like myself actually don't work that well, because if you think about it, you don't have that many keys that you use a lot on the right-hand side of your keyboard. What does this have to do with anything is we have these social proofs that kind of take off, and we're using an ineffective keyboard just because we've been told that this is the best way to do it, even though it's not. And it's the same thing with a lot of stories that go on about a lot of historical things, like the fact that Napoleon was short. He really wasn't that short. I think he was like 5'8" or something, and in which case he was pretty average height. Another one, he's either 5'6" or 5'8". At the time he was not that short. Other things that I can think about is the idea of alpha dogs, for instance, which the person who coined that term actually recanted his statement and said, actually, I was wrong about that, but it already had taken off. These stories take off, and we tend to trust them in this case. So I went a little off track here. The last one I want to talk is what's called the People's Temple. And this is something from, you may have heard this before, it's the Joe Jones cult that was actually inspired, I don't know why I thought of this, actually inspired the song Don't Fear the Reaper by the Blue Oyster Cult. That's what inspired this, but it's the cult one of the cults that committed mass suicide based on poison-laced, it was like a fruit or something. I don't remember if it was a fruit or drinking something in this case, but Joe Jones had an interesting idea of where he said, I'm going to move this cult from a place where everybody knows to another country. And it was, in this case, was Guyana. And we were typically looking into similarities in unknown places. So if you've ever traveled overseas, I've noted several people that I'm good friends with that would revert back to some of the things that they're used to. So one of my friends decided that they were going to go to Amsterdam, and where did they go to eat? They went to Five Guys. And I'd sit there and go, why? You're in Amsterdam. You got to try some new things that are probably going to be more accustomed to the area here, so that you get the full experience. But they're like, it was my embassy. It was something that I am comfortable with, and here I am. When I lived in North Dakota and traveled from Minnesota, there was only like one Chick-fil-A in that place, and it became my embassy. That I always wanted to go there when I go on a flight flying out of Minneapolis, because it was the only place I could get it if I was in that area. So again, go overseas and think about how much do you accustom yourself to some of the delicacies of that particular place versus the things that you're used to. So that's all for today, or for the week, I should say. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, you enjoy the beautiful weekend we're having. I hope it doesn't rain too much. It's really lovely outside right now. Otherwise, have a great day, and I'll talk to you next week. All right, thanks.